To the House Committee on Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources. We have a variety of matters to come before us today. Just so you have a sense, those of you in the audience and those of you who may be at home, we will begin with some meetings of appointees for secretariats that this committee works with. There are several bills that we're going to handle administratively today with a request from the patrons to strike, and then we'll turn to some legislation that has not been considered by a subcommittee but will be considered here. We think they're pretty straightforward issues of policy, and then we do have reports from subcommittees that have met in the interim. So with that, are there any, do we need to take the roll, Madam?
That would be great.
Let's take the roll.
It's coming.
There are more moving parts this year with hybrid and so on.
I'll have an error message.
Okay.
And we can do that later if you want it.
Looks like the roll is up. All right, the clerk will close the roll, and we will.
Delegate Edmonds is present.
Delegate Edmonds is present.
The clerk will close the roll. Delegate Weber, were you? Missed it. Okay. We will get you on the list.
And Delegate Plum.
Very good. We do want to welcome Secretary Appointee Matthew Lohr, no stranger to this committee, and Secretary Appointee Andrew Wheeler. We'll take you in that order before us, and so Secretary Lohr, if you would step forward, welcome you back. And just a note, if you have some things to say either about your background or the things that your secretariat considers or your what you see going forward, I'll be glad to hear that. There may be questions from the committee, and we'll take them as time permits this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Good morning. It is great to be back here before you today and see a lot of familiar faces that I've been fortunate to work with over the years. Certainly being back in Richmond again has been great to reconnect. So I'll just start off by saying, and I'll try to be brief in my comments, it's probably no surprise that I love agriculture and forestry. I've spent my entire life working to advocate and promote and advance these industries. Fifth-generation farmer in Rockingham County, beef cattle, poultry, row crop, sweet corn. My earliest memories were working alongside of my grandfather and my father. They taught me a lot about the industry, about hard work, and my involvement in the FFA organization gave me a passion for serving and leadership. And so very blessed to graduate from Virginia Tech. Taught middle school agri-science for a few years, like my good friend Delegate Orrock. Good to see ag teachers serving in the legislature, and then had a chance to buy my grandparents' farm in the late 90s and began a career in production agriculture and getting involved in the community, Farm Bureau, Rooten clubs, planning commission, school board, and then had the honor in 2005 to run and elected to this body, where I actually served on this committee as well for 5 years. And then in 2010, Governor McDonnell asked me to join his team as the Commissioner of Agriculture. My good friend Delegate Wilt ran and replaced me in the 26th district, and it's great to see him still serving those citizens back home. Did 4 years, absolutely loved the job promoting agriculture, working, advancing everything within the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Then went to Farm Credit for 4 years, working on the ag lending side, helping especially beginning farmers have the educational skills and the tools and the finances to be successful. And then the last 2 years, I was fortunate to go to Washington and work in the Trump administration leading the Natural Resources Conservation Service. It's the agency within USDA that's tasked with working with our farmers and ranchers and private forest landowners to address their conservation needs. 10,000 employees, 3,000 offices, $4.5 billion of our staff working with technical assistance and financial assistance to make them better stewards of the land. And I think all of those life experiences have prepared me for this position. Truthfully, this is my dream job, something I've always wanted to do. Very fortunate to be a part of the governor's team. As you know, Governor Youngkin is very big on growing the economy and growing jobs. His goal was 400,000 new jobs during his 4 years, and certainly a lot of those jobs hopefully are going to happen across rural Virginia in the agriculture sector. The APHID program that this committee has been a part of for many years is going to continue hopefully to grow and expand and help those ag industries that are looking to expand and grow and using those Virginia-grown products. Certainly looking at our marketing efforts, both domestically and internationally. Excited to see our ag exports continue to grow, and certainly looking at how we can reduce our regulations. The governor's goal of reducing regulations by 25% over the next 4 years. We're looking at our agencies to be able to see how we can do that to help business be more successful, help our citizens be able to navigate things a little easier as well. As you guys know, there's 3 agencies within the Secretariat, Department of Ag and Consumer Services, Department of Forestry, and the Virginia Racing Commission. So super excited. I will say you're going to hear from Secretary Wheeler here in a little bit. As you know, one of the big issues that the ag world continues to be involved with are BMPs meeting the 2025 goals of the WIP. And we've had a lot of conversations, and I think that the work that he's done at EPA and the work that I've done at NRCS will help us to be able to continue the work that our farmers are doing here in the state to help them make sure that they can meet those goals. So we're off to a good start looking at how we can work together and collaborate with our agencies to be able to utilize all of those resources available. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great to see you again. Great to be before you, and certainly happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It is a genuine joy to have you back before the committee now, and we look forward to working with you. There are several people who would like to either ask questions or make observations. I'll first recognize Delegate Orrock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, we go way back, and I truly think you're the right man for the job at this point in time in Virginia's history. And in addition to all the challenges that you've already identified in your role, I'm just going to throw out one other that I'm going to ask you to add to your plate. Okay. Given that rural Virginia is about 2/3 geographically, yet legislatively it's less than 1/3. The challenge I'm going to be conveying is that I will hope that the Secretariat and all the folks underneath you will work hard to impress upon those 2/3 of the legislators that don't represent rural Virginia how critical to Virginia's overall economy and the well-being of the entire state is. And I raise that not as anything against any of the urban legislators, don't get me wrong, but we all represent our own districts and we don't know what we don't know. And so therein, I think, is a challenge that I would put forward to you, just as it's incumbent upon those who represent rural areas to better understand the urban issues. In your Secretariat position and your unique background, I think you bring the ability to bridge that knowledge gap better than most we've seen in past history. So I commend you. You got a tough job ahead, but I know you're the man for the job.
Thank you very much. I will say, and for those of you who may not know this, but I'm sure you do by now, agriculture is our number one industry here in the Commonwealth, $70 billion. Forestry is number 3, $20 billion. 400,000 citizens of Virginia work in the ag and forestry sector, so it's extremely important. Yes, you're right. And once session is done, I'm looking forward to getting out of Richmond and getting around the Commonwealth and working with your constituents, working with you, working with businesses that are in your area, and certainly your farmers and ranchers. But yeah, urban ag is a growing component, and certainly looking forward to seeing how we can help folks in urban areas who want to be able to get more involved in agriculture. One positive thing about COVID, I think it taught almost every Virginian the importance of where our food comes from. And there's been a renewed interest, especially in urban areas, to see how they can better connect with our producers. And farmers markets are going to continue to grow, and CSAs and startups, people that have empty lots beside of them, putting up hoop houses and being able to produce more of their own food. There's a renewed interest in that. And certainly our Secretariat looks forward to being able to engage and work with all Virginians, and especially in those urban areas as well. So thank you. I will mention real quick, when I first came into the House in 2006, I was the only full-time elected farmer in the entire House. And I know we've got Delegate Weber and Delegate Ferris and Delegate Edmonds up on the screen. We've got a few more that have come since then, but that taught me a lot, being the only full-time farmer in this body. And I've told this story many times. It's not that urban legislators necessarily are anti-agriculture. They just don't necessarily have someone they can go to and ask questions and get to know. So I've prided myself over the years to try to build those connections and relationships, and look forward to continuing that in this role. So thank you.
Thank you. Next is Delegate Helmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask the Secretary-designate, we have made it the policy of the Commonwealth recently to really work on childhood hunger. We expanded the SNAP program to 200% of the federal poverty level, putting food on the table for 25,000 families in Virginia. And the Biden administration has made it a priority to expand access to SNAP benefits. And I just wondered what your work and what the policy of this administration will be to secure more SNAP funding for Virginia that both combats hunger and helps our farmers.
Sure. It's a good question. It's not a conversation I've had with the governor, so I don't want to speak for the administration, but I can say certainly, we are committed to making sure that we can provide obviously the basic resources for all Virginians. And certainly there's nothing worse than seeing our most vulnerable be hungry. And I can commit to you that we'll do everything we can to make sure that we are taking advantage of resources that are available. We had an event just last week with the food banks here in Richmond. When I was at Farm Credit, we worked hard to look at finding ways to provide more fresh fruits and vegetables with our food banks. And so projects like that will continue. But certainly, thank you for making sure this is on our plate. And I can certainly promise you that we will continue to look at ways that we can provide basic food for our most hungry.
All right, Delegate Marshall.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you, sir.
So Pennsylvania County, part of the district that I have now, and I guess I will have in 2 years, is that ag is still the number one industry in that location. Now, we built our agricultural base 100 years on tobacco. Tobacco is a product that is going downhill, and so we have brought forward, actually it was my bill a couple of years ago, and a number of people here worked on this, is industrial hemp, rope, not dope. And so, but it is a crop that I would ask of you to help, not only help grow it, and we could almost use a model of tobacco, where in Southside Virginia, we grew it, we process it, and then we made products out of it. So there's products that can be made out of industrial hemp. In Europe, there Mercedes, Porsche, BMW using hemp, industrial hemp to make dashboards, et cetera, out of that. So I think it's a full circle there that we can bring another product to our farmers who are losing so much income as far as tobacco. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely, sir. And
Thank you. Yeah.
tee that right up. So, as a matter of fact, I would agree with that. And I will say, on a personal note, about 4 years ago on our farm, we were back when you had to work with the local universities, and when everything was very controlled. We actually were one of those farms that actually grew hemp on our farm. So I've got firsthand experience with it. But you're right. The key is we've learned that we can grow it, but we've got to have some place to take it. And I think that's going to be the real challenge, is how can we attract the right processors into Virginia? And as you mentioned, plastics and those types of products that are being used in other countries, I think are very viable in uses. But it's got to be profitable. And so the first year, I think we had a lot of production, but they didn't have a lot of end users, so there really wasn't much profit there. But if we can get those to align, and certainly support industrial hemp, but looking forward to seeing it grow again, being a part of Virginia's ag economy, and certainly, hopefully, we can do the right business and working with the Commerce Secretary as well, if we can attract the right processors into the state to make sure that we've got good end products and could be a viable crop. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Delegate Bulova.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome back, Matt.
Thank you, sir.
It's good to see you. I've always valued our relationship, and remember that we came in as freshmen together back in 2006. So one of the frustrations that I've often had, both as a member of this particular committee dealing with agricultural BMP issues, as well as sitting on the Chesapeake Bay Commission, is oftentimes the disconnect between the federal level and the state level in terms of information sharing and making sure we're on the right or on the same page. And I think you're aware of some of those issues that we've experienced. You're kind of in a unique position, having been the immediate past chief of NRCS, to help bridge that gap. And I wanted to see if you could speak very specifically to how you are going to use that past experience to be able to work with the federal level to make sure that there is that information exchange that's necessary to get us across the line in terms of our WIP goals.
Absolutely. Certainly my experience at NRCS, and again, the agency that provides the technical and financial resources to work with our producers across the country, and specifically here in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, to help them address their environmental resource concerns. First of all, it starts with relationships. I still have a very, very close relationship with the current chief and the leadership team, and actually our state conservationist, Edwin Martinez, who works in Richmond. Actually, I hired 2 years ago, and we communicated yesterday, and as soon as session is over, I'm looking forward to getting out and meeting with him again, looking at how we can best partner. And also, I'll say with Secretary Wheeler, coming from the EPA, of course, the EPA is a very big player in all of this. And his background that he's had and the work that he's done with farmers across the country, I think will certainly be a great asset as well. A lot of it's going to be education. There's a lot of money out there. Of course, the state, you guys have done a great job with the Senate of appropriating funds for the Water Quality Improvement Fund to be able to really work and help our producers. It's expensive to put these practices on the ground, so there's state dollars, but there's a lot of federal dollars that can be leveraged as well. And so again, it's education and certainly being engaged and working with our federal partners, making sure that farmers know what resources are available. And I think with the combination of federal dollars and the combination of state dollars, I think we can really go a long way towards meeting those goals. So again, I think it takes, I learned at NRCS that the federal government cannot fix everything. We rely on partners, and certainly state government and NGOs and associations and all of those land trust groups, all of those have a role in this. And I think that being able to tie all of those pieces together will go a long way. So thank you.
All right, Delegate Ranson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So great to have you with us, and
Thank you.
I really appreciate your background in this industry, and certainly appreciate that you grew up in this field. It certainly makes that special to all of us. During COVID, we really saw a heightened market for Virginia-grown products, and I think that was really special to all of us. People really flocked to farm-raised products, and I think heard mentioned from Delegate Helmer, things that were fruits, vegetables, and people really appreciate that now. Can we see more of a focus on our products here that are healthy, farm-raised apples, fruits, vegetables, fish, and shellfish, and really marketing that product, not just within Virginia, but throughout the nation?
Absolutely. Certainly, Virginia has a diverse portfolio of commodities that we produce, as you all know very well, but so many of these products, we just need better awareness and better education and better marketing to make sure that people have access. And, I'm very big on promoting Virginia products. In fact, within the Department of Agriculture, before I got here, they were already starting to kind of revise the Virginia Grown program. Many of you may know the program's been around for, I think, 30 years, and we see the banners. And back when I was a kid, there were commercials, I think, promoting Virginia Grown products. I think we're going to look at how we can revamp that program. It's gotten a little stale over the last 30 years, but we've got to let people know that we've got an abundance of Virginia Grown products and how we can spread the word. And you're exactly right, Delegate Ransom. COVID brought an awareness to this. And so a spike in the interest in farmers markets and our CSAs, and even on our farm, we grow 20 acres of sweet corn and have a roadside stand that we sell every summer. And we can't grow enough. There's such a demand that people want to have their locally grown produce. So I can promise you we will continue to look for ways to expand products that our Virginia farmers are raising. So thank you.
Delegate Williams-Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, thank you. Good morning. So, I have two questions and a statement, or a comment, rather. The first question is regarding the comments that you made about rolling back regulation. And I kind of like analogies, so bear with me just a second, in that I sell real estate, and there are agents who've been in the business longer than me, and they remember when our disclosures were like 2 pages. Now they're 7. And I always say for every extra page or every extra paragraph, somebody did something egregious that they weren't supposed to do. Therefore, we have this. So with regard to rolling back regulation, I understand as a small business owner myself the need for businesses to be successful, but I also understand that there is a need and a responsibility that business owners and professionals, because your profession is in farming, that we have to the general public. So explain to me, or would you elaborate on how rolling back regulations that protect the public is more important than businesses making money and being really loosey-goosey with their procedures and their policies?
Sure, thank you. That's a very fair question. What the governor has said is he wants to take a wide look at all of our state agencies and see where there's regulations that are redundant or they're not really serving the purpose. Obviously, for example, with the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, food safety and the health of our public is very important. So I hope you don't misunderstand my comments that we're going to go in and just start cutting regulations willy-nilly. I mean, we want to make sure that our agencies still main responsibility of protecting consumers through our food safety inspection programs are still adequate and still in place, and we want to make sure that our consumers are still safe. But at the same time, within VDAX, and again, I'm on week 2, so we're just looking at, I know there's about 80 regulations within the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So it's really, some of these have been on the books for 75, 80 years that haven't even been looked at. So it's a matter of just sitting down and getting the right people around the table and just walking through and seeing, are there redundancies? Are there things that we can do that are outdated? So that's going to be our focus. As an example, it's a simple bill, but yesterday, Senator Deeds had a bill in the Senate that talked about grist mills, right? There's about 10 grist mills still in the state in operation, Mount Vernon and Wade's Mill, some of those where they actually make flour and cornmeal. These structures are several hundred years old. They're with the Department of Historic Resources. They're on their list, but they still technically fall under the same guidelines and regulations as a brand new business that's being built today. So that's an example of a very low-risk food that can still be able to, most of them are in a tourist area, can still be able to produce their cornmeal and flour, but not be under the same regulations as a brand new facility. That's just one example of a bill that was up in committee yesterday. So that's really what we're looking at. But I can assure you we're not going to sacrifice the health and welfare of our citizens in order to reach this goal.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, follow.
Yep. Delegate Williams-Graves.
Thank you. Second question is with regard to small and minority-owned farmers.
Mm-hmm.
How does your office, through the administration, intend to be supportive of small farmers, minority farmers, those that were, the entire farming industry, I understand, was hit very hard during COVID. Yeah. And I like a good steak just like anybody else. But how does your office, through the administration, intend to connect with those farmers and support those farmers so that they can work at their full capacity and produce their very best product?
Good question again. Certainly, just from a personal standpoint, this is an area that I'm very passionate about. During my time at Farm Credit, when I was running the Knowledge Center, we were very focused on minority, veteran, small beginning farmers as a focus, and looking at ways that we can provide educational resources and financing and mentoring in order to help them come into agriculture and be successful. So I've had experience in that. Truthfully, it's week 2. I'm not completely familiar with what policies and what programs that the department has in place now. I know it was a focus of the previous administration, but it's something that I feel very passionate about. I'm a 5th-generation farmer. I'm hoping that my kids will one day become the 6th generation, and I love, though, when people are coming into this industry for the first time. First-generation farmers, to me, are fantastic. And many times, as you mentioned, they're minorities, or they're in urban areas, or disadvantaged backgrounds, and are veteran producers. And so being able to see them be able to grow and succeed is very important to me. So I can promise you that we will definitely look at ways that we can continue serving them.
Thank you so much. And I have a great sweet corn recipe. Anytime you want to bring some, you are more than welcome.
The problem is you're all usually not here at the summertime, Mr. Chairman, so it's probably a good thing. So
We're going to hold Delegate Williams-Graves to that.
There you go.
Deliver.
Thank you.
All right, Delegate Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, Matt, great to see you.
Yes, sir.
First, just in regards to some of the regulatory comments that were made earlier, 4 years ago, with the Northam administration, we did a pilot program that was HB 883, in which we took a regulatory inventory across the Commonwealth, and then we had DPOR and Department of Criminal Justice Services roll back regulatory requirements. You mentioned outdated stuff, but also there's a lot of redundancy that we see across the Commonwealth, and we actually have legislation this year that's going to try and help address that, but let the executive branch and give you all the leeway to be able to do some of that, because some of that can be a pretty big burden on business when some of it can be redundant. So I'm glad you're taking that up. My question for you, as Delegate Marshall mentioned, and when we got into the discussion on hemp, was the lack of processors. Now, as you know, I sell beef, so I like a good steak, Delegate Williams-Graves. I also grow sweet corn, so I like sweet corn. So I can bring you some sweet corn. Now, we'll grab some of yours and we'll do a taste test.
There you go.
But my question is, as we get to the local, as Delegate Ransom mentioned, people like to eat local, and when the grocery stores were out of beef during COVID, they were coming to me. The problem that we have is that as you get new producers, a lot of smaller producers don't have the ability to find a processing date for their animals. How do you see your role in helping alleviate that issue?
Absolutely. That's been an issue that really has been happening now for many years, but we saw it really come to a head during the pandemic as people want to process their own beef, and there's just not processors out there. So this is definitely an issue, and even when we had a planning retreat a couple weeks ago with the governor, he actually raised this point as well, so it's on his radar. Yes, there's programs at the federal level. I will say the Biden administration, Secretary Vilsack is aware, and they are actually putting some federal funding programs available. But I think through our APHID program, again, we could hopefully try to address that, and looking at what our neighboring states are also doing as well. The problem, as you know, is they've got to be profitable. And so even in my tenure serving in various roles, that we've seen these processing facilities started up, but they were very heavily grant funded through federal and state dollars. And several of them are no longer in business today because it's hard to make them profitable. And a lot of it's the economies of scale, right? Because when you're bigger, you can use all of those products and have markets for all of it, where some of the smaller processors may not have markets for every bit of the animal. So it's lower profitability. So it definitely is something that we're aware of. I don't know the magic bullet, but we got to make them profitable. And just giving a lot of government money to start something up, and then when the money runs out in a couple of years and it sits empty, is not the solution either. But thank you for your comments.
Thank you. Delegate Lopez. The system's getting a charge out of you.
Thank you. Mr. Lohr, your reputation precedes you. Actually, I saw you speak in D.C. at your old gig when you talked about the needs of small farms. And it really meant a lot to me, what you were saying, and how much it matters, not just in Virginia, but across the entire country. And so I appreciate your service at the federal level. You spoke about your work at the federal level, but you also, there's been a lot of comments from Governor Youngkin. He actually he basically said that of the $190 million that Virginia got for agriculture and forestry and related industries for relief for those farmers that you care deeply about, he said that the entire American Relief Program, where we got that $190 million, was unnecessary. Do you agree with the governor about that statement, or do you feel like that is needed, necessary relief at this important time for Virginia?
I have not seen that statement, so I don't know the remarks that he made, and I would hate to comment on something that I didn't really hear firsthand. I think that clearly, I think that when we have opportunities and funding available to help folks that are in need, I think that money is there for a reason. And so, again, I don't want to comment specifically without hearing that quote, but generally, money that's provided, especially with COVID assistance, it can be very beneficial to all businesses.
Thank you.
Delegate Tran.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Hello, Mr. Secretary Designee. I think the connections between some of our more suburban and urban districts and our farmers might not be as tenuous as we all expect. In southeast southern Fairfax County, I have a grist mill, so I have the Mount Vernon grist mill. I also have Arcadia Farm, which helps to provide food to some of our local food banks, as well as train new generations of farmers. But I hope, the question I have for you, I hope, based on your own personal experience as a farmer, you've probably noticed that Virginia has experienced extreme weather. And this, I believe, is a result of climate change. So, for example, by mid-century, hotter and drier conditions in half of Virginia's counties are expected to put them at higher risk of water shortages. We know that this would cause serious threats to food production and livestock, affecting the livelihoods of our farmers. What is are your plans or Governor Youngkin's administration's plans to address climate change as they affect our farms, our agriculture and forestry industries? Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your question. And I'll say this was leading the nation's conservation agency. This was an issue that we dealt with on a daily basis. The good thing is agriculture has a very positive story as it relates to carbon sequestration and mitigating climate change. And a big emphasis of our agency was soil health, right? I mean, when the soil is healthy and you've got a crop that's growing continuously, you've got cover crops, you're doing crop rotation, all things that you can do to protect the health of the soil is a positive for mitigating climate change, right? So the good thing is farmers and ranchers across the country have a positive story to tell, and we're going to continue that through our conservation efforts. And certainly working with our Secretary of Natural Resources, there's a lot that we can do because agriculture's got a very positive story to tell. And so by utilizing the conservation efforts and the practices that we have in place and being able to tell that story, especially with cover crops and no-till production, minimal disturbance of the soil, all of those things that improve our soil's health really goes a long way towards improving that carbon sequestration. And I will say there's some carbon trading markets that are being developed where there's computer programs available that as a farmer, I can input my entire farm into a program with the practices that I have in place, with the crops that I'm growing, and be able to calculate what is the value of that carbon that's being sequestered. And as these markets begin to be up and running, farmers can be compensated for their conservation efforts. So again, it's a proactive approach, but if farmers can begin receiving compensation in addition to the cost share dollars that are out there, I think agriculture is going to be actually stepping up and doing as much as they can to help mitigate the challenges that you mentioned. Thank you.
All right, and concluding this morning, the questions for Secretary Lohr, Delegate Fillercorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Mr. Secretary Designee. I wish we had the opportunity to serve together. I believe I just came in as you were leaving.
Right at the same time.
Yeah. But your reputation, as Delegate Lopez has certainly preceded you. And as we all know, with these positions, certainly as secretary and just working in the cabinet and in the legislature, for that matter, it's all about relationships and and fostering those relationships and communication. And again, your reputation precedes you. How would you plan on working with regard to your connections with the agencies and the secretariats to protect our environment and more specifically focus on sustainable practices moving forward? You'll have a unique opportunity and be in that position, and you have relationships from years ago and certainly more recently as well.
Absolutely. Well, certainly keeping agriculture sustainable and viable that's the overall goal, right? We want to make sure that we're leaving our farm resources in a better position so that there'll be multiple generations to come. And you're right, in this job, it's all about relationships, and hopefully Delegate Bulova would agree that when I came in the House all those years ago, I developed just as many relationships with the Democrats as I did with the Republicans because we're all working together. And certainly I think specifically, as you mentioned about addressing the environmental needs that we have and sustainability, Agriculture is in a pretty unique place. It's expensive in many cases for farmers to implement the BMPs that they need to have, but we're at a situation where there's a lot of dollars available from the state and the federal government. So being able to reach out and encourage working with them, helping them to see that good environmental planning is good financial sense. It certainly pays off at the end. And so, again, leveraging relationships that I've made in the past and working with our agency leaders, working across secretariat lines as well. Farmers want to do the right thing, but it helps to have the technical assistance and the financial resources to do it. And certainly we're going to continue to make that a priority. So thank you.
Secretary Lloyd, thank you very much for responding. The range of questions, the range of interest that you heard today, I think is indicative both of the membership here, but also the range of questions that we consider and bills that we have to undertake. So thank you for your robust responses to these and knowledge of that. And we really appreciate you coming before us today and look forward to working with you in the months and years ahead.
Well, thank you. And I will say to the urban legislators that I have not had a chance to work with, I do look forward to being able to connect with you in my travels because I do believe that there's many opportunities to promote Virginia agriculture and forestry in those urban areas. So certainly look forward to being able to connect in my travels and see what's going on in your districts and see how we can help. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. Secretary Wheeler, we welcome you, appreciate you coming to be before us today, and look forward to hearing from you any observations you'd like to make about your experience, your professional roles, and what you see for the department that you've been selected to. And then obviously there are likely to be questions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee, for the invitation to appear today. I've been a resident of Virginia and an environmental attorney for over 30 years. I began my career at the EPA in 1991 as a career employee in the chemicals office, and over the course of the next 4 years, I won 3 EPA bronze medals for my performance and service. I then worked in the United States Senate for 14 years, becoming the staff director and chief counsel of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. I then went into private practice, where I represented over 25 different clients. As the press reports, I did represent a coal company, but they don't report that my #1 project for them was advocating for the Miners Protection Act to shore up the retirement and health care benefits for the United Mine Workers, legislation that was co-sponsored by Senators Kane and Warner and most of the Virginia House delegation, including Congressmen Moran and Conley. I also represented an air quality management district in California, a solar company, a renewable fuels trade association, and several farmers and food producers. I was then tapped to be the deputy administrator of the EPA and took over as the administrator after only 8 weeks when the president asked me to step up after the resignation of my predecessor. I calmed the atmosphere at the agency, and I involved the career staff more in the decision-making process. During my tenure at the EPA, we reduced air pollution 7% for the 6 criteria air pollutants, 7% by the end of 2019, pre-COVID. During COVID, air pollution dropped even more, but prior to COVID, we reduced air pollution 7%. We cleaned up 82 Superfund sites, delisting them from the national priorities list, double the number of the previous administration. We finalized the lead and copper rule, the first update to that regulation in over 30 years to address the Flint, Michigan issue nationwide. Part of that update included the first ever national mandate to require the testing of drinking water in schools and daycare centers. I did this because lead affects children worse. The younger the child, the more impact it has on their health. So we require the testing in all schools and daycare centers. We finalized 4 regulations to address greenhouse gases, including the first ever regulation to address greenhouse gases from the aviation industry. We proposed it in 2020, and actually the Biden administration finalized it this past year. We also had a robust enforcement policy, collecting more in civil and criminal penalties than the previous administration. I'm happy to address any questions that you may have about my background, but I really want to focus on what we as Virginians need to do going forward. I did not apply to be the Secretary of Natural and Historic Resources. I served on Governor Youngkin's landing team for the Natural Resources section. And when we briefed him on the problems that we face, and I told him particularly concerning the Chesapeake Bay, he ended up offering the position to me. I told him, as you all know, that we are not on track to meet the 2025 WIP for the Bay. The current plans enacted by previous administrations fall short. More work needs to be done by everyone if we are going to improve the Bay and meet our deadlines. That is why last week I appeared before the Senate Agriculture Committee to support speeding up the timeline for the City of Richmond to end the dumping in the James River. I've been working on that since last week and was supposed to meet with the mayor this afternoon to go over plans on how we can help provide the financing that the city needs in order to meet the deadlines. It's my understanding, well, the meeting has been canceled because the mayor has tested positive for COVID, but we will be meeting as soon as he's back in the office. The governor believes, with my unique background, having run the EPA and working in a senior leadership position in the U.S. Senate, that I know how to access federal funding and assistance to make the difference for the state. I have been a strong proponent for the Bay, and I can get the job done. In addition, I want to bring more certainty and transparency to our permitting process through efficiencies. I want to work to implement the Coastal Resiliency Plan. And as an Eagle Scout, an avid hiker and camper, I want to promote our statewide outdoor experiences for all Virginians. This includes an assessment of our needs and goals to promote greater access to our outdoor opportunities. The environmental problems we face in the Commonwealth are immense, and it will take bipartisan initiatives to both protect and conserve our natural heritage. I have a long career in trying to bridge differences on these issues and protect the resources that we all share. I've actually said for over 35 years that the best job I ever held was Nature Conservation Director at a Boy Scout summer camp when I was in college. I worked there for 3 summers, living in a tent. You couldn't get much better than that. When I became the EPA Administrator, I said it was then a tie between the 2 jobs. This position, if I'm confirmed with the conservation portfolio and the environmental protection aspects of this position, may very well top every job that I've ever had. With your support, I want to make a positive difference, and I know that I can. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate you giving us that background because I think many of us, having known Matt, that part is easy, but we don't know you as well, obviously, and so it's helpful to get a little bit of a taste and a feel for where you've been and the things you've been involved in. Thank you very much. We do have a number of members who have questions or would like to speak to you. I'm going to start with Delegate Marshall.
Thank you and welcome this morning. So tell us how you would approach finding funding for, there are a lot of dams out there that private and public dams that are questionable. And so that is a issue that is looming, and we just don't have the funding to do that. So is there federal funding that can help us fix these problems?
The problem, of course, is when they are private dams as opposed to public dams. I worked on 3 different Water Resources Development Act bills when I worked in the Senate, which funds and authorizes the Army Corps of Engineers. So I have a long history of working with the Army Corps. I would try to reach out and see what we can do there and what federal resources might be necessary. There may have to be federal legislation to help us on that aspect. One of the first things that I want to do, and I've already I've met with the heads of all 5 of the departments or agencies under my secretariat, and that was one of the first issues I raised was on the dams themselves, and the fact that first we need to do an assessment, and then we need to figure out what resources are needed to shore up the dams that are in distress. But it probably will take some federal funding.
Thank you.
Delegate Lopez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for the Secretary Designee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello to a fellow Eagle Scout. I think there are only 2 of us in the House of Delegates now, so we keep dwindling. Yeah, just a quick statement and then a couple questions. You had said, actually, that you were on the Senate Committee on Environmental Public Works. You were the chief counsel. The chairman at that time was Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, who is famous for being the chief climate change denier in the U.S. Senate. So I just want to make that clear. Under your leadership at the EPA, it appeared as if you were intentionally trying to dismantle the agency and eliminate EPA safeguards. You went out of your way to undermine EPA's role to protect public health and the environment. In just your first 12 months, Mr. Wheeler, you sidelined scientists to propose to restrict the use of scientific data. You gutted the coal ash rule. You recommended unsafe levels of drinking water contaminants. You rolled back Clean Water Act protections. You suppressed an inconvenient formaldehyde report, which concluded that it would cause leukemia and nose and throat cancer. You ignored EPA scientists' advice to ban asbestos. You weakened the mercury emissions rule. You slammed vehicle emissions rules into reverse. You rescinded the Clean Power Plan, whose goal was to dramatically cut carbon emissions, which was a gift to the coal industry. And to make matters worse, for folks who care deeply about the Chesapeake Bay, you proposed a 90% cut in funding for EPA's Chesapeake Bay program. The Union of Concerned Scientists wrote that that was just in your first 12 months at EPA. That EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler has killed or weakened dozens of safeguards with the sole intention of bolstering polluting industries' profit margins, even after Congress slashed the corporate tax rate. As a result, millions of Americans will be drinking filthier water and breathing dirtier air, and more will suffer from serious diseases, according to EPA's own accounting. Before you became EPA Administrator in 2019, 3 former Republican EPA administrators, William Riley, Lee Thomas, and Christine Todd Whitman, warned the public about your becoming their successor. My question is, why shouldn't every Virginia environmentalist or person who cares about renewable energy or parent who cares about their children not breathing dirty air or drinking or having clean drinking water be scared out of their mind that you might potentially become the Secretary of Natural Resources and have sway over the DEQ?
Well, first of all, you raised a number of issues, and I would love to address every single one of them, and I'll be happy to meet with you to go over each of the ones on your list. But there's a few in particular that I do want to address, but all of them are inaccuracies as far as the record. We cleaned up the air, 7% reduction in air. Water quality when I left office was the cleanest it's been in the country. I protected children's health through the lead and copper rule that I just mentioned. I do want to just hit on the Bay funding, the asbestos, and the formaldehyde. If you'd like me to address any of the other accusations, happy to do those. On the Bay funding, you're referring to the Bay funding for the Chesapeake Bay geographic program, which was $82 million. There are about a dozen geographic programs across the country. None of them were ever authorized by Congress. OMB at the White House cut the funding for all of those geographic programs, and knowing that Congress would restore the funding. That was only $82 million. Most of that went to staff salaries in the building, which I knew would already be paid for anyway, regardless of what was in the budget. But what I also knew was that $82 million is not enough to clean up the Bay. So while that political dispute was going on, I don't consider myself a politician. I'm more of a technocrat. While that political debate was going on between the White House and Congress, I looked to provide funding for the Bay programs, and I secured over $500 million in different programs, including $220 million for Hampton Roads, $202 million for their sanitation project, actually their water reuse project that they're injecting the reused water back into the aquifer, $202 million for the city of Baltimore for a new wastewater treatment facility to stop the CSO from going into the Bay, millions of dollars for farmers in Pennsylvania, because that's one of the largest problems that we have left for addressing the Bay issues of the farmers in Pennsylvania. And the Hampton Roads actually was over $1 billion. $220 million has already been delivered to them, but they already have the authority to go back for the rest of the money as they need it. So overall, although $500 million in the 2-year period that I was administrator, I committed to over $1 billion in programs to clean up the bay, which is, compared to the $82 million that was a political fight, I thought it was more important to get the projects completed that will get the bay cleaned up. On formaldehyde, I did not suppress a report. There was it's called an IRIS risk assessment that has no regulatory impact at all. It had been mired in scientific politics between different scientists at different agencies, different offices within the EPA, as well as other federal departments. What I did was I put formaldehyde on the list, the TSCA list, for it to be reviewed as one of the first 20 chemicals under the new TSCA law that can end up in regulations. So I had the choice between spending a lot of time and capital on a risk assessment that was not really going anywhere, or actually putting it in the hands of the people that can make a regulation to limit the use of formaldehyde. And I chose to put it on the regulatory track instead of putting more resources on a track that the agency had spent over 15 years on the risk assessment, and it still wasn't finished. I thought it was more important to put it in the regulatory track instead. On asbestos, we actually moved to close the loopholes on asbestos. Currently, under current law, you can still import some products that contain asbestos. It's not been banned. All aspects of asbestos has not been banned. I had to be careful when I was the EPA administrator not to prejudge a regulatory decision when you start a process, because then it's grounds for being overturned in court. I'm no longer the EPA administrator, so I can say that I put asbestos on the track to be completely banned across the country, closing a loophole that had been in place since the early 90s when the George H.W. Bush administration tried to ban asbestos, and the court struck down half of their regulatory approach. But I can go down the list of the other issues that you raised if you like, but there's a lot of misinformation about what I did at the agency, and I stand by my record that the environment improved under my watch. And on the EPA side, I did not try to dismantle the agency. By my last year, we were onboarding more people than were leaving the agency. When I got to the agency, over 40% of the workforce was eligible to retire. And so I hired a new human resources director, and we created some new creative programs to try to get more scientists into the agency to replace the ones that were retiring. I pledged to the EPA employees on day number 1 that I would leave the agency stronger than I found it, and I did.
One final...
Delegate Lopez, you had a follow-up question.
Yes, one final follow-up.
I would simply note we do have quite a number of folks in the queue. We've spent almost half the time that we spent with Secretary Lord. There are limits for each of us. So if you can be
very brief,
as concise in your questions, I think will help all of us to have a
Thank you,
conversation.
Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Lopez.
We can definitely have a conversation anytime over coffee and get into the weeds on a lot of these issues. The one point I'd like to make, though, is that because of the failed efforts regarding the Chesapeake Bay and the issues that D.C. and Maryland and Virginia had with the cleanup efforts that were not happening, they actually took you and the agency to court, and then you referred to that lawsuit as frivolous. There are definitely more facts about each of the things we've talked about, but we'd love to have that conversation. I'd love to have a conversation offline.
Absolutely. The lawsuit that was filed by Maryland and Virginia and D.C. was over New York and Pennsylvania not meeting their 2025 WIP obligations. Virginia and Maryland were not meeting their WIP obligations either. And I said at the time that it would be better if we all worked together to try to get all the states to meet the WIP obligations instead of having to spend a lot of time and resources litigating it in court. So yes, I did think the lawsuit was inappropriate at the time because we need to work together, all the states in the Bay Commission. But Virginia and Maryland, when they filed the lawsuit, neither one were meeting their WIP obligations.
All right, Delegate Ferris.
Good morning, Mr. Wheeler. I heard a lot of things in your first comments that raised questions, but I'll try not to ask too many here, whatever the chairman will allow. First off, we have a great state park system, and I learned a lot of that from my friend Terry McAuliffe. And what are your plans to expand that? Because there's especially during COVID, I think we found that there's a backlog in those state forests or state parks are full. It's hard to get camping availability for. I think it's probably some tent spots, but the camping spots need to be expanded, and I'd like to hear what you plan to do about that.
Certainly. First, I think we need to do an overall assessment of the capabilities that we have and the resources that we have in all the state parks. And it's my understanding that the cabin camping in particular is oversubscribed. There's not enough for the demand. What I want to do is to increase the capacity of the parks and then also increase the usage. But we need to increase the capacity first. We have an acting head of that department, and I've already said that we need to do an assessment overall of all the state parks, and if we need more resources, I will be the first to say that we need more resources. I also am in taking a look at this, and if there is a website within the state government, I'm not aware of it. So I've looked at all of them individually within the Secretariat. If you live in a county in Virginia, it's not easy to find out what all of the outdoor recreational opportunities are for you, because you have to go to the different departments to look at what each one has. And I think we need to do a coordination effort, and I'd love to see maybe a new website or something through the Virginia Tourism Commission to click on a county and see what are the, at least within my department, what are the state parks, what are the historic preservation sites that you can go visit, what are the wildlife refuge sites that you can visit. For the marine coastal, what are the fishing places that you can go within Virginia? We don't do I don't believe we do a good enough job explaining to the Virginia public all the different resources that they have at their fingertips. And that might bring down some of the capacity at the parks if people know that there are other opportunities within easy driving range that they can visit and access.
Fair enough. Mr. Chairman?
Delegate Ferris.
As a cattle farmer, talking about the Chesapeake Bay and the WHIP programs, that's something that's very important to me and a lot of my colleagues. In my personal life, what can you tell me your plans are for getting us where we need to be with that?
I've already had conversations with my colleague here about working with the ag community. We do have to do more. Everybody has to do more as far as the Bay is concerned. That includes CSO issues in a number of cities, including here in Richmond, but it's also working with the agriculture community. I provided a lot of grant money to farmers in Pennsylvania through EPA to try to reduce the runoff into the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Part of that is also we created a new nutrient trading program, a pilot program to try to encourage better nutrient programs by farmers. I visited a farm in Ohio where they did some experimental work on fertilizing. They were able to measure using computer equipment. It was just fascinating what they were able to do. Within 6 inches, the amount of fertilizer that they needed to apply in their fields by computer, and then they applied the fertilizer in the fall. And they were able to use a lot less fertilizer than if they fertilized in the spring, which is apparently what most farmers do. By fertilizing in the fall, you use a lot less fertilizer, and there's a lot less runoff. So it's practices like that I'd like to see encouraged across the Commonwealth, and I want to work with the Secretary of Agriculture, and I want to work with. I'd much rather work cooperatively with farmers than to use a hammer, but we do need to make some improvements across the board.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have plenty of questions, but I'll yield some time to others.
Thank you. There are a number of folks who would like to be in this conversation. Delegate Helmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 2 questions, but I'll be very brief. Mr. Chair, I'd ask the Secretary-designate, in your Senate EPA confirmation hearing, you stated that I believe that man has an impact on the climate, but we're not completely understood what that impact is. You've now overseen the nation's climate science and climate scientists in many ways. How has your view evolved, and what specific actions directed at industry will you take that mitigate Virginia's impact on climate?
Certainly, if I could also I'd love to talk to you also about food, not right now, but I did a lot on food waste at EPA, working with soup kitchens and a soup kitchen in the Bronx and a food bank in Las Vegas, and getting grocery stores and large sports arenas to donate food that was still fit for people to help feed people across the country. Food is the number one by volume that goes to our landfills across the country. So there's a lot of things that I'd love to work with you on in that regard. As far as climate, I did 4 regulations. We finalized 4 regulations at EPA to address climate, including the first ever for aviation. I met with the scientists at the EPA to get educated on the climate issues as soon as I got to the agency. During my confirmation, and I'm not suggesting he would endorse me, but I had a productive conversation with Senator Merkley from Oregon. Thank you. I get Oregon and Washington confused sometimes. From Oregon, and who raised coral bleaching to me as an impact from climate change, and he wanted me to look into that. And that was one of the issues I raised with the staff, and one of the reasons why we moved forward on the regulations that we did. But I also addressed coral bleaching in other ways. We actually banned a chemical that's used in the boating industry as a paint on the side of boats because it was harming the coral reefs. And I visited a lab in a marine lab in Florida that is doing some remarkable work to produce and grow coral in the laboratory that can then be transported out to the oceans. So and I mention that because there is both adaptation as well as regulation, and I believe both are important. I did not have to regulate greenhouse gases as EPA administrator. I actually had a petition from a conservative think tank to overturn the endangerment finding, and I don't believe that was appropriate. After Mass versus EPA, the agency was required to move forward with the endangerment finding. So I could have easily overturned the endangerment finding and not done anything to address climate change. But I thought it was important to address climate change, and I thought the law, the Clean Air Act, as well as the Supreme Court directed me to do so. I did not go as far as a lot of people would have liked me to do, because the Clean Air Act is very limited in scope. Going back to the previous question from Delegate Lopez, I did not overturn the Clean Power Plan. The Supreme Court put a stay on it. So when I got to the agency, they put a stay on it because it went beyond the Clean Air Act. So we looked at it, and I told the staff, what legally can we do to address the climate issues from the electric power sector? And we came up with the ACE rule, the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which reduces CO2 emissions from the electric power sector. So I followed the law. Congress, the United States Congress, has never passed climate legislation. So I had very narrow lanes in which to enact any regulations to address the issue. When I know the difference, as I said, I worked in the United States Senate for 14 years. I know the difference between legislating, and I know the difference between running an executive agency. And I am not going to legislate as a secretary. I'm not going to create laws. I will implement the laws that the legislature passes. That's what I did at EPA. EPA has very limited authorities to address climate change, but I was still able to get 4 regulations done to address climate.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, just a quick follow-up question.
Delegate Helmer.
I really appreciate the conversation we're having today, your words and how you're talking about what you would do and have done environmentally. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, the perception, not just by Democrats, by Republicans like Christine Whitman, who was a former administrator and former Republican governor, she said that at the EPA used ideology to drive environmental policy instead of letting science drive policy. So that's the perception. Many would say that's the fact. What specifically are you going to do differently in this role in Virginia that will cause Virginians to believe that science and not politics is driving the actions of the administration?
Well, I'm going to implement the Coastal Resiliency Plan. I'm going to get the bay cleaned up and work very hard to get the WIP in place, the requirements by 2025. As far as the regulations go, I believe in modernizing regulations. I believe in taking a look at EPA. We had regulations that dated back 50 years. I modernized those regulations, like the lead and copper rule. I absolutely listen to science. One of the biggest complaints that you see in the press is on the science transparency rule that I did at EPA. Most of the complaints, I believe, center around the original proposal, We put out a proposal on science transparency that was actually drafted before I got to the agency. We got a lot of comments back. We went out with a supplemental proposal before we eventually finalized a rule. And what that science transparency rule did, and it's mischaracterized in the press a lot, is it requires when a regulatory agency makes regulatory decisions, and when EPA would look at hundreds, sometimes thousands of scientific studies to reach a regulatory decision. The new science transparency rule that I finalized required the agency to identify the pivotal studies that were used to make the decision. Because the agency may look at hundreds or thousands of studies, but they really concentrate on a handful of studies to make the regulatory decision. I would take that same approach here in Virginia to tell the public how we're making the decisions and what the basis for those decisions are. For those pivotal studies, we required in the regulation that the data be made available to the public so the public could understand. I believe I cut my teeth at EPA in '91 working on the Community Right to Know Act. And I really do firmly believe that the more information you give the public as to the basis of your regulations, the more informed the public will be and the more accepting of new regulations. I think that is one of the problems on the climate side. The people who deny the science on climate, a lot of it is because of the information, the data is not available to the public. The modeling information is not explained. I believe if everything was out there in the open and everybody could take a look at the data, take a look at the modeling, there would be more acceptance on the path forward on what needs to occur, not just on climate, but on any regulatory issue. And I firmly believe that if we make things transparent and we explain the basis for the regulations, there will be more acceptance as to the regulatory decisions that regulatory agencies make.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Delegate Orrock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Wheeler.
Good morning.
First, just observation on my part that as I've been receiving communications about certain issues that people have with what occurred at EPA while you were there as the director, my conclusion is it's kind of been a circumstance of where you changed things from the previous status quo, and your energies were more focused on prioritizing positive, achievable environmental impacts during your tenure. So with that kind of as a preface, that being said, how do you see your position as secretary of overseeing the various agencies versus trying to direct the policy implemented by the various agencies?
Well, you know, on day one, when I was actually I think it was day three, I began EP administrator on a Friday midnight, and I gave an all-hands speech on Tuesday. And I told the EPA staff that I will defer to them and I will listen to them, and I did. And they changed my mind on a number of issues where they briefed me. And I had career scientists and career employees in on all my briefings for all the regulations, particularly all the major regulations that we did. I will listen to the career employees here in the Commonwealth, the 5 departments. I visited DEQ last week and met with the senior management. And one of the senior managers thanked me for coming and said that that was actually the earliest a cabinet secretary had ever visited DEQ during their tenure. I have meetings scheduled. I've already met with all 5 of the heads of the departments, and we are in the middle of scheduling the rest of the meetings with the senior managers. And I have told all of them that I want to have all hands meetings with all of the employees, either virtually or in person, depending on how we can arrange it. I'm also told, however, that I should probably wait until after the session ends, because I'm going to be busy for the next 45 days or so before I hold those all hands meetings. But I did that at EPA. I visited every EPA regional office when I was administrator in all of our major labs. I did not get to all of the labs because of COVID. But every time I visited an EPA office, I gave a speech to the EPA employees, and I took questions from them until they had no more questions. And then I told everyone, if you want to come up and talk to me one-on-one afterwards, if you didn't want to ask a question in front of all your peers. And I would hang around and take individual questions from the staff, sometimes for up to a half hour, 45 minutes after my speech finished, because I wanted to hear what the employees thought, and I cared about their opinions. Again, I started off as an EPA employee, as a GS-9 employee out of law school back in 1991. The EPA workforce, and I know that there's a letter signed by 150. I had 14,000 employees under me at EPA. Most of the people who signed that letter, by the way, did not work at EPA while I was there. Most of them retired long before I got there. But I've always maintained that the EPA workforce is some of the most dedicated federal employees in the country. And I talked about that in a number of speeches. And I would talk about the fact that people grow up wanting to go work at the EPA or wanting to be a park ranger or wanting to be part of the Marine police that we have. People are dedicated in this field. And I gave a speech once, and I'm at the risk of backfiring on me again. I would always make the comment that I don't think people grow up wanting to go work at the Department of Transportation. And after I was finished, the moderator at the panel came up to me and said, just so you know, Andrew, I started my career at Department of Transportation, and I always wanted to work there. So I quit picking on the Department of Transportation. I'm risking a lot, I guess, mentioning that now here. But I believe in the employees of the agencies and departments, and I can't wait to meet and work with the employees here in Virginia across the board in all five of the departments under the Secretariat. Hopefully that answered your question.
Delegate Willett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Wheeler. I did have some friends who left the EPA under you, so get to those employees quickly. We've got a great staff here at DEQ and other agencies, so I want to keep them. My question is this. During this session, DEQ and members of this body have declined to recognize that they're historically marginalized communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental policies and practices. Do you believe that we need to address environmental justice issues?
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that I did at EPA, the Environmental Justice Program at EPA began as a very small office back during the George H.W. Bush administration while I was at EPA. But it was headquartered in the enforcement office at EPA. And we moved the Environmental Justice Program to the administrator's office because I thought environmental justice and the enforcement, that's at the end of the process. That's just focuses if there is if there's environmental issues or problems on the enforcement side. I thought it was important to bring the environmental justice issues to the forefront when we're developing regulations at the very beginning, when we're working on grants at the very beginning, and it shouldn't be relegated to the end of the process. So we brought the Environmental Justice Office into the Administrator's Office, and I think that was a much better approach on addressing environmental justice issues. And then I worked, particularly through the Superfund and Brownfields programs on addressing environmental justice issues. Worked with Superfund cleanup in East Chicago and also in East St. Louis. Through the Brownfields program, we cleaned up a site in St. Louis and turned it over to the Boys and Girls Club. And Ozzie Smith from the Cardinals is created a golf academy for inner city youth in St. Louis. And I just think that's an incredible use of an old polluted site to be turned into a golf academy through the Boys and Girls Club to benefit inner city children. There was when I was the deputy administrator, one of the first Superfund sites I worked on as deputy administrator was in Pueblo, Colorado. And that was a community predominantly lower income, Hispanic and Native American. They had lead in the soil in their yards. It was a Superfund site, and under the EPA Superfund program, it was slated to be cleaned up in 13 to 14 years. And I looked at the number, the values, the lead values in that soil, and I said that was unacceptable. And I was able to get additional funding to get that site cleaned up faster. We got all of the yards cleaned up in under 2 years. Well, it was supposed to take 13 to 14 years. We got it done in under 2 years. And so that is generations. If you think, most children playing in the backyard in the dirt are under the age of 5 or 6. There was generations of children that did not have to play in soil contaminated with lead. I would love to have been able to solve every single problem like that as administrator, but what I did do was emphasize those programs like the one in St. Louis, like the one in Pueblo, Colorado, to the EPA staff so that they would focus more on the risk to environmental justice communities, on the risk to children, and prioritize getting sites cleaned up, in particular where there was human exposure to whatever the contaminant was. So I do believe, even though I wasn't able to personally work on every site in the country, by highlighting those sites, and I did that on purpose, to highlight specific sites to encourage the EPA staff and also the state DEQs around the country to prioritize the cleanup of sites where human health, and particularly children or environmental justice communities, are impacted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, indeed. Delegate Wilt.
Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Okay. Next would be Delegate Goditis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would ask the Secretary-designee, how can you demonstrate to us, given the well-documented record of sidelining science, first of all, by eliminating the Office of the Science Advisor, by replacing experts with industry-friendly participants on panels, your rule to sideline studies that had private, what am I trying to say? Many of us in this room have advanced degrees that relied on studies where we had to keep personal information private. So that doesn't eliminate the validity of studies. You have 150 former EPA employees writing, Mr. Wheeler sidelined science at the agency, ignored both agency and outside experts, rolled back rules to cut greenhouse gases, protect the climate, and took steps to hamstring EPA and slow efforts to set the agency back on course after he left office. What can you tell us about your views of data-driven science as documented that will demonstrate that you have really turned over a new leaf and will from now on follow the overwhelming and often long-standing science on climate change, environment, conservation, and health and safety protections?
With all respect, I disagree with the premise of the question. I don't believe I sidelined science at the agency. I understand that letter. It was signed by 150 EPA, former EPA employees, for the most part, who never worked for me at the agency. If I can give a couple of quick examples. First of all, I did not eliminate the Science Advisory Office. We combined that with the AA ship under ORD, Office of Research and Development, and that has been done in previous administrations as well. So that was not eliminating that role. And that was a reorganization within ORD that was career-led. They came to me with the new organizational chart. I blessed it. I didn't make any changes to that. That was the career scientists at EPA that reorganized the Research and Development Office to make it more efficient and effective. As far as on the scientific data, which I believe you're referring to, health studies on people, I did not discount that science, and I did not. And I did not say it could not be used. That goes back to the science transparency. I began to answer a little bit on the science transparency as far as the pivotal studies. If I could finish explaining what that regulation did, which is where that complaint comes from. For those pivotal studies, I did require that the underlying data in those studies be made available to the public. On the health data for individuals, that can be masked. FDA masks that data all the time. We can do that with the EPA studies as well, so that you can release studies, the data in the studies, and mask the identity of the people. But based upon comments that we received in the proposal and on the supplemental proposal, because we went out twice for comments to make sure that we got the science transparency regulation right, there was a number of steps to make sure that we could still use any scientific study. The first exception was, well, the first requirement was that the data had to be made available to the public. If it was not made available to the public, then it had to be made available to the EPA scientists. If it couldn't be made available to the EPA scientists, then it would have to be made available to a third-party organization to review the underlying data. And that was based on bipartisan legislation I worked on in the 90s involving the Harvard Six Cities study, where there's a lot of questions about that study and whether or not it was accurate And I worked on legislation to get that underlying data released to an organization called the Health Effects Institute. And they reviewed, so I never saw the data, neither anybody else in Congress, but they reviewed the data behind the 6 cities study and said that it was all valid. So using an organization like that, if you can't do any of those 3 things, if you can't make it available to the public, if you can't make it available to the EPA scientists, or you can't make it available to a third-party review organization to review the underlying data, the EPA administrator can still say this pivotal study is so important that we're still going to use it for regulatory purposes. I believe in transparency. I go back to when I started at EPA, community right to know. I firmly believe that all regulatory decisions will be much better accepted and by the public if we explain to them the rationale and the reasons behind the scientific information that we use to make regulatory decisions. I believe too many regulatory decisions in the past have been made in a smoke-filled back room where they come out and they say, this is what we're going to require. And then you end up having a lot of litigation and a lot of fighting, and people going to either state legislatures or the United States Congress complaining about regulations, and you get writers and so forth. I believe that if we make everything open to the public and we tell people why we're making a decision, that the decisions will be better accepted by the American public. So that was my reason and intent on going forward with the science transparency regulation, which is, and I understand some scientists don't like it. A lot of scientists view their data as proprietary, and they don't want other people to see it because it's something that other scientists could then perhaps use to write their own studies and so forth. There are certainly some people who've attacked the regulation because of that. But again, we provide it at the suggestion of a number of scientists through the rulemaking process and the notice and comment process. We provided that exemption for the EPA administrators to say, no, this study is too important. We need to use it regardless of whether or not the data is made available to the public. But I think as a fallback position, everyone should support more transparency and regulations. Thank you.
Delegate Fowler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for the Secretary-designee. As somebody who spent a lifetime on the bay and the rivers of the Commonwealth, I greatly appreciate your testimony at this point. But I have another question. Virginia has several partners that share the responsibility for the Chesapeake Bay, and I'm just curious as to what ideas you may have for that relationship, moving forward.
When you say partners, are you talking about within the state, or are you talking about with other states?
Within the other states that impact the Bay, yes, sir.
Absolutely. The Bay it's going to take cooperation of all the Bay partners in the Bay Commission. One of the things I did as EPA administrator was bring environmental justice issues to the forefront in the Bay Commission. And I worked hard to make sure that all the states within the Bay Commission had the resources, as much resources as we could, to address the problems. And again, one of the biggest problems is the state of Pennsylvania. They contribute a lot to the pollution in the Bay, but quite frankly, they don't get much benefit from the Bay, as opposed to Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, et cetera. Same is true for New York, for that matter. They contribute a fair amount of pollution to the problem, but they don't get necessarily that much benefit. The 2025 WIP was agreed to by all the partners, and we need to hold everyone accountable to meet those requirements. And there are a number of different organizations that are working to improve the Bay and working to coordinate to make sure that the Bay does improve. But I believe, as state of Virginia, that we have to set an example, and we have to show that we're serious and we're willing to make the decisions and the sacrifices that are needed in order to clean up the Bay, which is why I support it and why the governor supported the legislation last week to speed up the requirement for the city of Richmond on the CSO going into the James River. And I was surprised it was not. I thought that legislation last week would be the entire committee would vote for it, and they didn't. It was not unanimous. It passed the committee, but there's a number of people who opposed it. We have to do more if we're going to meet the 2025 deadline, and the 2035 deadline for the city of Richmond is too far out. 2030, quite frankly, may not allow us to meet it either. But we have to do more, and we have to do it faster than we currently are.
Mr. Secretary, I'm very grateful for the time you've given us, the very extensive and granular answers that you've given to very specific questions or general questions. It's much appreciated. I do take from your remarks that you're open to taking questions and having a direct personal conversation, which you said to several members along the way, and I appreciate your willingness to do that. Obviously, there have been questions. Some of the news accounts have been, have been what they will be. But we appreciate both yourself and Secretary Lohr being with us, taking this time, being willing to respond to a range of questions brought from a variety of people. I do have others in the queue, but we also do have legislative work that's on the schedule. So I'm going to take the liberty of the chair and at this point turn from the interviews element of it. And those of you that do have questions, and as I say, there are a number of you that are still in the queue, but I feel like we've had a good conversation. It's been wide-ranging, and again, I'm appreciative of the time that you've taken to be with us and illuminate us on your views and on the elements of the departments. It's a great one for some of our members coming to this committee for the first time. So, again, my appreciation, and we look forward to having the chance to work with you in the months and years to come.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am more than happy to meet with any member of the committee one-on-one to answer any questions that you may have, because there's a lot of misinformation about my background, and I would love to have time to clear up all of the questions and concerns you may have. And I know, Delegate Lopez, you raised a number of issues. I've addressed a few more of them after our exchange, but I would be happy to sit down with you and go over the rest of your concerns.
All right. Thank you very much. And we will turn now to a number of matters that have come before us. Some have been to subcommittee, some are administrative, and we'll begin with administrative matters. I have 3 bills that the patrons have made the request to strike, and they can be taken in a block.
Second.
Let me list what those are. I see the eagerness to press on with business, which is refreshing. House Bill 395 from Delegate Willett, House Bill 845 from Delegate Bloxham, and House Bill 948, Delegate Hodges. Chair will entertain a motion.
Move to strike. Second.
Motion and a second to strike those items. Members will cast your votes.
Delegate Edmonds.
Votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. That motion is carried unanimously. All right, and then we have several folks who have been waiting patiently to present their bills. So let me turn first, numerically, is House Bill 49, a scenic river designation for a component of the Virginia Scenic River System. Delegate Ferris.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. House Bill 49, this designates 44 miles, portion of the James River that from Nelson, Appomattox, and Cumberland counties is a component of the Virginia Scenic River Systems. I think it probably is going to conclude most of that stretch of the James River from coming here to Richmond, I hope.
All right. And I take it you do have support for the sections, the localities there have
yes, sir.
Joined in that. Okay.
We do have some.
Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Dominique Leverada. I'm here on behalf of the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission. Some of you might know David Blunt. I've been working for the PDC and David for about 2.5 years now. I work primarily on our legislative programs with him, as well as our Chesapeake Bay WHIP program, so it was nice to hear BMP and WHIP get thrown around a lot today. I don't often get to hear that at the PDC. But our environmental program is growing like a lot of the legislation in the country right now. But we're here to speak on behalf of the substitute for House Bill 49, which adds an additional 37 miles to the James River as a Virginia Scenic River. And this is from Allens Creek to Stearns. And this section bookends a 20-mile segment of the James that was designated by HB 1598 in the 2020 session, if you may remember, for a total of 57 miles of the Middle James to now be designated in this region. The substitute also references its designation in a change to Title 10.1, Chapter 4 to accommodate a pending water supply project along one of the river segments in Fluvanna County. We've spoken to their county administrator about this as well, Eric Dahl, to provide clarity that such designation does not impact that project. The protection has also been provided in similar situations. And the third enactment clause provides a little bit more clarity on this.
Thank you for that, and I'm sure Delegate Ferris is appreciative of the description of the substitute that we probably need to adopt. So there's a motion and a second to adopt the substitute for House Bill 49, which has been described for us. Discussion on that motion. Hearing none, those in favor of the motion to adopt the substitute, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? All right, the substitute is before us. Delegate Ferris, anything else to add at this point? All right, I do believe we have folks to speak to it, and let's start with anyone in the room. Is there anyone here that would like to speak in favor or against? All right, if not,
everyone's just ready for it to pass.
That's probably true. But we do have folks signed up. You don't need to speak if it looks like this one's on a roll, but if you would want to, we certainly would welcome. First, Mrs. Layton Powell.
Hi, I'm Layton Powell, Mr. Chair. With the state of Virginia, we support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Pat Calvert.
Mr. Chair, Pat Calvert, thankful to the delegate for bringing this forward, and we fully support this on behalf of Virginia Conservation Network.
Thank you. And Anna Killius.
Mr. Chairman, we'll just take the opportunity to thank the delegate as well and urge you to support the bill.
We appreciate all of your succinctness. All right, what's the pleasure of the committee?
Move to report as amended.
Motion is second to report the substitute for House Bill 49. Discussion. Hearing none, members will cast your votes.
Delegate Edmonds.
Votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. House Bill 49, the substitute, reports on a 20-2 vote. All right. Next up, we have Delegate Scott. You have been very patient with us, so let me take you next. I know you've been waiting a good while, and appreciate your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hopefully this will go as smooth as the last one. This is House Bill 561. This bill is a code cleanup. I'm a member of the Code Commission. This bill comes on recommendation from the Code Commission to clean up some of the issues that are not set out in obsolete sections of the code regarding corporations.
Delegate Scott, the one we're looking for is House Bill 562. Is that the one?
562. I'm sorry, I said the wrong number. I have them both here. It's the same issue. I apologize, yeah.
Okay.
And both of them are cleaning up technical revisions in the code related to corporations and ag throughout this section. And this is a recommendation from the Code Commission.
All right.
And I entertain any questions.
Very good. Any questions from members? Hearing none, what is there?
I don't think there's any. I've received no opposition. No one's come out of my office to say anything against it or for it other than the Code Commission. And as you know, those are made up of judges and attorneys across the Commonwealth who look at the code.
All right.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to report House Bill 562. Discussion? All right, members will cast your votes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee.
Delegate Edmonds.
Votes aye.
All right, the clerk will close the roll, and that House bill does pass unanimously.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee.
Sir. All right, Delegate Rasool.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. If I could call your attention to House Bill 323, which aims to expand slightly the very successful food and farming infrastructure grant program, increases the amount of a matching grant from $25,000 to $50,000 that the matching grant for a political subdivision may apply for to help local farmers with food production and agriculture. There have been several grants this past year that have helped. For example, in Franklin County, some canneries allowed community members and local producers to preserve their harvests. So that way you could have these facilities, which have been in operation for 80 years, continue on. In the city of Harrisonburg, a small USDA-inspected slaughterhouse was able to replace some of their outdated cooling systems to help local farmers there. And Mr. Chair, we had a number of different great examples, including one in Shenandoah County, which enabled a produce aggregator to flash freeze high volumes of Virginia-grown produce, so that way they could wholesale it to local retailers. So we're hoping to increase the eligibility for this matching grant.
I see several members of the committee have either questions or observations. First is Delegate Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for the patron. So you're increasing the amount that can be given out, and it's a matching grant for the localities. When we funded the grant, was all of it used at the $25,000 level?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, Delegate Weber. What this allows is for the APHID fund, the APHID dollars that we allot on an annual basis, to allow for localities to apply for these small grants, some as low as $4,000, to help do these little projects to help some of the farmers. The APHID pot as a whole has been a very constructive grant program that has three parts to it: one for planning, one for economic development for large-scale projects, and then this one is for local food and farming infrastructure grant projects. And so it has been a great program that has been successfully implemented for some years.
One more question, Mr.
Delegate
Chairman.
Weber.
Sorry. So we fund the APHID grant at, I forget, a couple of $1 million, right? And your legislation increases the amount for an actual grant from $25,000 to $50,000. Could this limit the number of grants that the state awards?
Mr. Chair, Delegate Weber, this increases the eligibility. So for a matching grant, so a locality could apply for anything up to $50,000. And then, of course, we have, based upon the recommendations through VDACs, what we think might be best for that project.
Thank you.
If I could just interject, I think part of the question that Delegate Weber was asking is if, in the increasing to 50,000, how much is the program subscribed, and would this, in effect, get us to the limit and thereby limit other folks having access to these funds? I think my sense is that that's what Delegate Weber was after.
Mr. Chair, this will actually be something that we would continue to discuss as there are proposed increases to the APHID program. And so hopefully we will actually be able to not only fund it at its current level, but at an increased level, which will help all of it because it comes from one pot of money. This past year we had 8 successful projects from localities.
Delegate Orrock.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to try pretty much the same question, but in a different way. In the current grant monies out there, have they been fully utilized in an annual basis?
Mr. Chair, Delegate Orrock, that would be a question for VDACs to see if between the 3 different programs that they have, because it all comes from one pot, if they exhausted all of the funds.
And your phone a friend on staff is shaking her head, no, they have not been.
Oh, good, so that there is even more funds available for these localities.
Okay. Thank you.
Very good. So I guess we have that. Delegate Tran.
Thank you. A question for the patron, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Delegate Rasool,
Are you aware of situations where there's a greater need than $25,000 for the grants so that there could be additional capacity that is being implemented in our local communities with these grants?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Delegate Tran. When this idea was initially crafted by a variety of community stakeholders, the thought was to have even a significantly higher amount because some of these centralized processing facilities, for example, slaughterhouses, whatnot, have a considerable price tag. And so what we decided to do was to come in and try to help with some of these smaller projects and see how it goes. And after this year of success, elevate that a little bit more just to try to hit that hole. With some of the very large projects, that goes into a different bucket with the facilities grants that VDAX administers as well.
Follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Delegate Tran.
Thank you. Delegate Rasool, so I just want to make sure I understand that while it may be the case that not all the grant monies have been allocated or awarded, since it's a grant, the issue, I just want to make sure I understand, the issue is the size of the grants in order to make the biggest difference in the local communities. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Delegate Tran, that's correct. So if we have the opportunity to ensure that some of these good projects that help local farmers get their food and products to market quicker, that would be a big help. And now we'd be able to go after a few more sizable projects. And what we see anecdotally, and I've got a full list for committee members of some great projects all around the Commonwealth that this has been able to support.
All right. And we do have a agency member from VDAX who's on Zoom who I understand can answer some of the questions that we have. So I'm going to turn just now to the name I have is Melissa Ball. Are you on the line? Yes.
Hi, correct. Good morning. I hope you all can hear me okay.
We hear you fine.
And the specific question?
I think you've heard the discussion. Can you give us just maybe a short summary of where we are right now and in relation to some of the things that have been asked about this proposal?
Certainly. So the grant program was created and the inaugural grant round was awarded on December 31st. And it's my understanding that they're going to hold 2 rounds annually going forward. And the program had 12 applications requesting a little over $250,000, and they funded 8 of the 12 with an average about $13,000 per grantee. So there is room to certainly to spend more and fund more projects.
All right, thank you. Delegate Helmer.
Mr. Chair, this is either a question for VDAX or for the delegate, but if we expand the potential grant size to $50,000, do we anticipate this would help ensure we're actually utilizing all the grant money, as the awards will be potentially larger and therefore we won't be leaving money on the table that can help our communities?
Ms. Ball, if you could respond to that, that would be helpful.
Yes, the increased amount would certainly be beneficial. It would attract larger grant applicants or larger applications, excuse me. That would be more beneficial to the specific industries.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. Let me see if there is anyone in the audience that would care to speak to this measure, either for or against.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Stephanie Talon with Virginia Farm Bureau. We do support the program and the bill. You've already heard this morning discussion about the lack of slaughter and meat processing facilities within the Commonwealth. And again, this is one of the items that the program seeks to address by funding those type of infrastructure projects. So we do support the program and the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room to speak? If not, we do have one person signed up, and that would be Mr. Pat Calvert.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Pat Calvert, Virginia Conservation Network. Thankful to Delegate Rasool for this legislation. There was broad bipartisan support for the 2021 bill that came out, and we hope that you'll support this one to help broaden it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we've heard some discussions, various perspectives on this. Delegate Rasool, you'll have the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The only thing I'll add is they had to run to another meeting, but Virginia Agribusiness Council has endorsed the measure as well.
Very good.
Move to report.
It's a motion and a second to report House Bill 323. Members will cast your vote.
Delegate Edmonds.
All right, the clerk will close the roll. House Bill 323 passes unanimously.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members
Thank
of the
you.
committee.
All right, we had House Bill 809 on the docket, but the patron has asked that bill go by for the day. All right, so that bill, without objection, will go by for the day. All right. Turn then to subcommittee reports, and we'll begin with the Chesapeake Subcommittee. Chairman Bloxham, I know you have had I was there for part of it, and I know you've had a fairly extensive conversation about a number of bills, and are bringing before us several that your subcommittee voted favorably on.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first bill, House Bill 184, there are a substitute, and it is some technical edits, and I think the patron would like to explain those for you now.
All right, Delegate Marshall.
So, Mr. Chair, we accepted a substitute offered by DEQ, and now we understand that we need to reject that substitute, and we have an amendment to the substitute. Okay, never mind. So let's move the substitute.
All right, there's a motion and a second to adopt the substitute. Discussion on that motion. Hearing none, those in favor of the motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed? All right, the substitute is before us. Chairman Bloxham.
And then I understand that we have an amendment to the substitute.
Mr. Chairman, there is a very technical amendment down on line 220, the very end of the bill. It should refer to a VESMP and a VSMP. So it should also include a Virginia Storm Management Program. That got left out. That acronym got left out.
The acronym amendment is proposed. Is there a motion? Motion and a second to adopt that. Discussion. Those in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. Those opposed? All right. The substitute, as amended, is before us.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. This bill basically allows a locality that already administers a Virginia Stormwater Management Program or Virginia Erosion and Stormwater Management to do it on a regional basis for an industrial facility if the proper memorandums of understanding are signed. And it passed our committee 10-0, 10-0, and I so move.
All right. For the description of the bill and the vote in the subcommittee, is there discussion? Hearing none, members will cast your vote.
Delegate Edmonds.
The clerk will close the roll. House Bill 184 passes unanimously. All right, Delegate Bloxham.
Next is House Bill 189. It is a bill brought by Delegate Weber. It puts aquaculture as a use that the VMRC will use when they determine the proper use of a ground. It puts it on par with SAVs or any other. And it doesn't give it preference. It just puts it on par with subaquatic vegetation and the like. So it passed the subcommittee 10-0, and I so move.
All right. Second. Motion to on House Bill 189 to report. Is there discussion on this measure? All right, members will cast their vote.
Delegate Edmonds.
The vote's aye.
The clerk will close the roll. House Bill 189 passes 22-0. Delegate Bloxham.
And the last bill was House Bill 771. Delegate Hodges brought this forward. It's requiring a locality to submit to the Department of Quality, which they already do, the elements adopted by the locality concerning the Chesapeake Bay preservation areas. What this does is ask the locality to post what it sends on its website. And it passed the committee 7-3, and I so move.
All right, there's a motion to report House Bill 771.
Second.
Duly moved and seconded. There was obviously a difference of view in the subcommittee. Is there anyone that would care to speak to this? Or Delegate Ranson, I saw you, appeared you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
I voted against this in subcommittee because I was concerned there may be a fiscal impact or some concern with my localities. Obviously, this impacts those of us that are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And I just wanted an opportunity to call my county administrators and some of my board members just to see if they had concern with the bill. And a couple of them did respond, and they said, we are already doing this anyway. And I did speak to the patron of the bill. So I'm going to change my vote. I'm going to vote yes. And so there you have it.
Thank you. Delegate Wilt, you were next.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd originally voted for the measure, but since that time, I just had questions, localities. I guess their website's up to speed. They're in a position to do that, I guess. Can't answer that, but it sounds like Delegate Ranson did some research on her end, so that was the only question I had, making sure that everybody is able to do this.
All right. And Delegate Orrock.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'm not sure who to address these to, whether subcommittee chair or whomever. I mean, I heard the description that the locality has to post this, but as I'm reading the language, unless it's been amended from the original bill, this is having the department posting the information, which we have not adopted.
Move to adopt the substitute.
All right, hang on. So what I'm hearing from Legislative Services is that there is a substitute which changes or responds to the question Delegate Orrock has just raised. So let me return to the chairman, and I guess the appropriate...
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Yes, there was a substitute adopted in the committee. I so move.
All right. And just as we're going forward, just for those of us who are not there at this point, and let me ask, I guess, Lisa, if you could tell us briefly how the substitute alters the bill.
Yes, sir. The bill as introduced would have required localities to report information about their local plans to the department, and then the department would have published all of the information on its website. The substitute changes it to remove the reporting requirement, or to remove nobody has to submit anything additional to the department, and then each locality would publish the criteria for their plan on their own websites.
All right. Delegate Orrock, was that responsive for your question?
Except, if I may, Mr. Chairman, Lisa, does it also bring in all the same specificity of 1 through 6 of the things that have to be a part of that?
Mr. Chairman, that has not changed. That language is also taken directly from regulation that localities currently have to have that information as part of their plan.
All right. Delegate Williams-Graves, you had made a request to you get your question answered. Okay. Okay. Very good. I believe we have answered those questions. There is a motion to adopt the substitute. Those in favor of the adoption of the substitute signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? All right. The substitute is before us. Delegate Orrock, question.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, my only concern, I don't have an issue with the existing policy, but my concern gets more into the practicality of it. We're now putting into code what is dictated by regulation. So whenever the regulations change, we're going to have to come back with another bill versus, and I mean no violence to the bill, but I would guess I would ask, could this go by for the day, allow me to get to the patron and see if they would just have be objectionable to having language that consistent with regulations, this is what has to be posted.
That seems to me a very reasonable thing, and I would agree if that is the import of the bill, we do not want to put it in code where it can't keep pace with regulation. I think.
He was here earlier and said he.
I'd request to go by for the day.
Yeah. Okay. There's a motion to take this bill by for the day. And the second discussion. Hearing none, those in favor of the motion will say aye. Those opposed, excuse me. All right, that bill is by for the day. We do also have a report from a subcommittee that met this morning, and I believe that subcommittee, while its chairman, Delegate Edmonds, is with us, taking the chair because he could be physically present with us, is Delegate Marshall. So, Delegate Marshall, I know we had you this morning, and we had to re-up. Are you prepared to present the subcommittee report?
Yes, I think we just have a handful of bills, and so the first one is House Bill 140. There is an amendment to the that we passed, and I so move.
All right, and just in brief, you tell us what the bill, or is there?
So what the bill does is it just changes the dates. It qualifies historical African American cemeteries and moves that to from January 1, 1900 and prior to 1948. And maybe Lisa, if you can give us the amendment, please.
Mr. Chairman,
I hear Delegate Fillercoin.
I'm just looking online and I don't see this agenda or these bills, so I don't know what we're looking at.
My apologies. Would you repeat the question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I don't seem to see these bills or the agenda from this subcommittee online.
Let me, the committee will be at ease for just a moment.
So, Mr. Chair, these
It is currently before us, and thank you for your excellent participation today. And Delegate Orrick?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I just had an ask, I guess, at this point. For those of us who are used to working with the paper versions, we bring those with us, I get it. But given that typically the substitute language is not available before we get here, could I ask that staff provide printed substitute language for us to peruse compared to the original legislation? Because to the point of what we had this morning, I didn't know what the substitutes did because they're typically not released until we get here. And I can talk to Lisa about that off, but yeah.
Sounds like the question can be answered offline. We'll let you know as we come to committee next week. With that, the committee will rise.